Today we have Ahmed Al-Kholi, Yusuf Al-Difa'i, Bakinam, Zaid, Lindsay, Delton. And our first presenter today is Dr. Ahmed Al-Kholi, joint paper with Ghada Yassin. I will start introducing our first speaker. Dr. Ahmed Al-Kholi is a professor at the Arabian Gulf University, Bahrain, and Munafeh University in Egypt. He has extensive experience in participatory strategic and action planning for urban and regional plans and national environmental management programs. He took part in designing several national and regional development projects and led the evaluation of several ones. He has published reports, books, chapters, and over 30 scientific papers. I would like to welcome Dr. Kholi, and the floor is yours, and the timer is on.
Thank you, Amir. Let me share my screen.
Go ahead.
You see it now?
Yes. I'll mute myself.
Okay, our paper, the title is Are Cities in the Arab Region Ready for the 4IR Impacts on Image, Identity, and Culture Heritage? Since 2016, when Klaus Schwab coined the term the fourth industrial revolution, the world has already picking up that term, and about it's unlike the first three industrial revolutions, where in this event or this phenomenon, it's where physical, digital, and biological domains of technologies are unclear. The 4IR offers Arab cities and other cities opportunities to solve some of their problems regarding sustainability. But at the same time, they come with challenges. So one of the things about the fourth industrial revolution, it's about digital readiness. But digital readiness, in our opinion, is not enough, because it has to associate with the use of these digital technologies. Replicating monuments could hurt the local economy of the cities with cultural heritage, because, as we said, one of the technologies that come with it is about the digitalization, about 3D printing and stuff like that. So the paper attempts to examine the Arab cities' readiness to use 4IR technologies and avoid their drawbacks. So we use three indicators in the analysis. The first is the Change Readiness Index. The second is the Global Innovation Index. And the third are the Global Human Capital Index. These three indices are at the national level. And for us, we didn't find something for cities, but it is because of the issue of urban primacy. So, for example, in the Gulf, there are many city-states. In Egypt, there are about 45 or 50% of the urban population live in urban areas. So we think that these indicators can be proxy that can serve. We augmented our analysis with a survey posted on SurveyMonkey, where it asked the participant, interviewee, to assess his or her knowledge about the 4IR, the attributes of the 4IR, its impacts. The questionnaire included open-ended questions because we used these responses to conduct some qualitative analysis using Atlas TI, which is UDA, qualitative data analysis. Our results show that the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia topped the Arab countries on the index for change readiness in 2019. They ranked 5th, 12th, and 30th out of 140 countries, which means that their cities could compete globally. On a global innovation index, UAE came the 36, Kuwait 60, and Qatar 65. Now we go to Egypt, which is 92, Algeria 113, and Yemen 129 out of 100 nations included on the index. The Global Human Capital Index in 2017 shows that the GCC countries top the list of the Arab countries. Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and Yemen, countries with rich cultural heritage, are at the bottom of the list. Despite that they possess sites included in the World Heritage Sites of the UNESCO, both natural and cultural, these countries are very at the bottom, and that means that they will not be able to be using properly the technologies that the 4IR avails. Now we go into the measuring for the cities, and we look into the most competitive city for 2019. Out of the 25, none of them are Arab cities, even Dubai, which comes with a higher score of 26.33. Dubai is not among the 25 of the world's most competitive cities. Most of those competitive cities are in the US and Australia, East Asia, China and Japan, as well as Western Europe. Cities from GCC succeeded to improve their rank. That's it. Now, the rank of the city depends on first, the business activity, human capital, information exchange, cultural exchange, and international political engagement. We collected the data from the survey and did this word cloud where we can see some of the major words that came according to the frequency here. But let me tell you about our sample. 32% of them were 25 to 35. Now,
go ahead, I muted. It was a mistake. Go ahead.
Okay, 32% of them were in the age cohort of 25 to 34. About 50% earned their PhD degree. Most of them are architects, urban designers, and planners. About 40% of the interviewees responded that they have read or heard about the 4IR, which means that 60% don't know what 4IR mean. For those 40%, for them, they identified 4IR by artificial intelligence as an attribute to the 4IR, the Fourth Industrial Revolution. They perceived the impact of the 4IR in the terms of changing land uses, which is okay because most probably transportation, modes of transportation and stuff like this have to do with the changes that most settlements will experience. Now, when we went to the question about what are the words we found that about replica, accepting or approving, we found that monuments, originality, value, protect, history, heritage, replicas, authenticity, culture, historical are the major words that tourism, you can see it here, are the major words that came with high frequency in the responses of those who indicated they know what's 4IR. 50% of them approved replicas for monuments. The reason is to protect the original monuments, to revive lost heritage, to preserve, restore, record issues, allowing everyone to get a chance to see the famous monuments. The other 50% of those who do not approve the replication and the use of 4IR to produce replicas, they were concerned about the authenticity, tourist attraction, original production context, historical value, cultural significance, and marginalization of the value of the original monument. Now, based on the data we collected, and the analysis we did in the Atlas TI, we can see that there are three major themes: the profile of the interviewer, the knowledge of the 4IR, and the replica their position on the replica. And these are the different codes. And we can see how they are, visually, we can see them, how they are linked. And the distance and the allocation here, the software does it based on the loadings in the codes and the theme. Now, to make sure that what we see is empirically verified, we did this code matrix where we can see here the coefficients indicating the strength of the relationship between the different codes. As you can see, there are very strong ones, like here, the interviewee copyright and the interviewee's rationale, which is almost one, because when you approach the one, that means perfect dependence. If you approach to zero, that's totally independent. Let me go here to the discussion of the results. The secondary data that we collected, as well as the statistical analysis, suggest that except for the GCC countries and their cities, readiness of the Arab cities to make use of the 4IR technologies is limited. All Arab cities have serious issues regarding human capital, which is central to the use of the 4IR. There is a significant correlation between human capital and the global innovation indices, suggesting that not all Arab countries are really ready for the 4IR. Countries rich with cultural heritage are the least prepared to make use of the IRR and respond to the issues that associate with the technologies. I mean, the negative effects of these technologies. Almost half of the respondents did not precisely know the term 4IR, indicating that practitioners and some scholars rarely read and follow developments around them, which is very sad. Those who have heard or read about the 4IR expressed opinions about replicas that reflect an understanding of the potential positive and negative consequences on the image, identity, and cultural heritage of the city. Awareness is not enough without knowledge about new developments and understanding of how to make use of these developments. In conclusion, the 4IR technology started already to have effect on many aspects of life. Three parameters determine the Arab city's ability to respond to any contemporary transformations. The first is about technological infrastructures. The second is about innovation, research, and development. And the third, the use of consumer technology, such as mobiles, laptops, and so on. Not all Arab cities are ready to make use of the opportunities that the 4IR technologies avail. Arab cities are rich with monuments that shape the identity of the city and attract visitors. Some of these monuments are subject to destruction, others have been replicated and placed outside their context. The 4IR technologies will encourage production of high-quality replicas, raising issues regarding authenticity and trust. There must be actions to make use of 4IR technologies through institutional reform. At the center of the reforming of the current institutional framework responsible for managing these societies is paying attention to education and scientific research to make use of available 4IR technologies and appreciate the value of cultural heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We didn't need to use the yellow or the red background. Thanks for being on time, and very interesting topic. I have a few questions, and I'm sure the floor also will do, but we will go to the next speaker now because we'll have the questions towards the end. Our next presenter is Youssef Al-Difai. Youssef, can you put can you share your screen? Yes.
Yes, hello.
Youssef Al-Difai is a PhD researcher at the School of Architecture, Design, and the Built Environment at Nottingham Trent University, researching the reinscription of memory, valuing local narratives, informal practices, and spatial memory within the physical recovery of Mosul's Old Town. Youssef gained his master's degree in architecture from the University of the Creative Arts, Canterbury in 2018. Yusuf has attended multiple conferences and workshops in Europe and in the UK. So now, Yusuf, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction. Right, so first of all, I'd like to say that I'm honored to be here amongst the high-profile academics, and I'm very pleased to be able to show a part of my research that will hopefully be going on a paper to be published. So I think I'd like to think of this project as more of a documentation rather than kind of a discussion of a few theoretical context. It does build on theoretical theories, but it's more of a documentation of something that's undocumented and is happening right now in the city of Mosul in Iraq. So I've called it Replacing Home. And it discusses the displacement of communities, practices, and interactions in post-war Mosul. So in case you haven't heard of that city, it's the second largest city in Iraq. And the old town of Mosul is located in the heart of the city, as you can see on the left map here. So that's the border of the old town. And the destruction in the old town has been immense due to the 2014 to 2017 ISIS insurgency, during which there was multiple destroyed heritage sites and an immense destruction for the buildings, for the houses and commercial buildings. So the map on the right overlays all the destroyed buildings in Mosul's old town on top of the older map of the city. So the ones in darker gray are the original buildings, and everything in white is a destroyed building after the 2017 insurgency. So we can tell that the destruction is immense, and it has left multiple scars in the city's cultural heritage and physical built environment. So let's take it one by one. So first of all, let's talk about the tangible destruction of the city. There are 54,000 destroyed homes in the whole city of Mosul, during which there were 62 demolished schools, and in the old town alone there were 3,000 destroyed homes and 41 compromised heritage sites. And if we talk about the intangible side of the destruction, there were more than 9 sects lived in the city from 3 different religions. There are 500,000 displaced people, and I'd like to add this is out of 1 million original locals. So effectively, half of the people of the city have been displaced following the ISIS insurgency. There were 40,000 casualties, and if we kind of contrast that against the fact that the city had more than 4 specialized markets, and in these markets there were craftsmen and artisans that have been there for multiple generations. So they inherited their shops from their parents and grandparents, and they kind of learned the craft from generations of a know-how, and they did that in their own location-specific markets. So if we contrast that, then we can start to see that there are multiple questions that might arise from all these insights, like, for example, what happened to the sects and what happened to the displaced people. But in this project, I'm really focusing mostly on the shop owners and the impact of these, the abandonment of these specialized markets, and how does that impact the city's cultural heritage and the built environment alike. So the research question is, what is the impact of the mass displacement of generational shop owners on the interactions, communities, and spaces of the old town? And this is the theoretical framework / aims of the project. And so, like I said, it takes Mosul's old town as a case study. And the existing research surrounding Mosul's old town, because it's more or less a new situation, but it has been looking at Mosul's old town as a lost space, because it has lost its, as researchers put it, its image and identity. But more other research look at it as a hub for physical landmarks. So they take its very old physical landmarks as case studies in which they look at ways to conserve them or reconstruct them. But there has been no research on this kind of intangible aspect of it, and what's the impact of the locals' displacement and this generational crafts that have been going on in Mosul for generations. So in this research, I take on the the habitus as a framework. So the habitus is the physical representation of cultural capital. So what I mean by that is that our interactions, practices, and activities are ingrained in us through the long periods of times we spend in our social situations. So therefore, we grow kind of a feel for the game. And this makes us naturally interact with the physical environment and respond to the environments against us. And then, so what happens to the habitus when we have that abrupt change due to the immense war that we just mentioned a few minutes ago? So that really interlinks with the displaced communities and the resulting abandonment. So in a way, it attempts to bridge this gap between the tangible and the intangible in this time frame in Mosul's Old Town. So it aims to document the displacement of the locals and shop owners in the Old Town. It pinpoints the emerging locations in Al Aysar. So the Aysar is the other coast of the city, which is more modern and it's less impacted by the war. And the shop owners and locals are immigrating there from the Old Town of the city. So I'm attempting to pinpoint where they went to there using GIS maps. So all the maps that I will show you in this presentation and the one that I've already shown you have been created with ArcGIS by myself, because there have been no previous documentation of the city in GIS. So it provides that kind of database for future reference. It studies traditional interactions and architectural elements in pre-war Mosul to highlight how they changed in post-war settings, to really, again, documenting the undocumented so far, and address the change in the itineraries and patterns of movement. So this is kind of the intangible front, and trying to visualize that and highlighting the impact of the intangible change. Sorry. So for the methodology, it's been an extensive work. So this is a product of 3 years of work. It's a part of the PhD. But I started with a pilot study in the UK because I'm undertaking qualitative methodologies, and to immerse myself in the city spaces, I have to be there for a very long time. It's very time consuming. Researchers have attempted to do that by being there for 9 months and really getting to know the communities. However, because of COVID and the security situation in Iraq, it has been almost impossible to do that. So I started with a pilot study in which I have undertaken interviews and surveys with local Moslawis online. And then it kind of built up this database of maps, and I started to understand the spaces of the city, albeit remotely, which sets out the scene for the site visit. And then I spent around 3 weeks in Mosul, during which I underwent workshops, semi-structured interviews, ethnographic observation, and walking interviews. And we had a multitude of kind of data from that. There were participant-produced maps. I've got some insights regarding the perspective on post-war Mosul and the individual memories in their original spaces. And so it kind of built this web of individual memories, which, as we all know, an intense web of individual memories resembles that collective remembrance. And then that helped to build the ArcGIS maps and really visualize the data on these maps. So just a little bit of a quick word on the sample. So there were 95 participants in total. I had 66 surveys and 29 interviews. There was a sampling criteria, and these are made to make sure of the authenticity of the statements, because some of the people in Mosul never actually were interested in visiting the old town before the war, and they just live in the left side. So there were criteria to make sure of how relevant the sample will be for the data. So for the project, like I said, it's trying to look at the tangible and the intangible abandonments. And I started to look at categorizations, I started to quickly realize that they are not to be taken in isolation. So to start with the tangible abandonment, we all know that there's a destructed built environment, there are abandoned urban spaces and neglected residential areas. And for the intangible abandonment, we can see that there are displaced community groups from the sects, and we have discontinued patterns of movement, so abandoned spaces. And then there are disappearing cultural practices and crafts, but they don't work in isolation. For example, let's say the destructed built environment really connects with the discontinued patterns of movements because they don't go there anymore. And then it also connects with the disappearing cultural practices and crafts. And similarly, the displaced community groups caused the neglected residential areas, because they left the spaces in which they vitalized for multiple generations. Because most of the community groups, even though they are kind of, let's say, I hate the word integrated, but they are a part of the city's cultural heritage, and they have been kind of dense in one area, which has their temples and they have their commercial and religious spaces. So following their abandonment, there's a resulting neglected residential areas. So there are four main kind of steps into looking at this to make sense of abandonment in a way. So it's displacement of the locals to the left side of the city. And then there's a resulting abandonment on the tangible and intangible layers. And then there's a compromised network of meanings, and we'll talk about that network in the next slide. So that's on the wide scale. There's a change in the city's meanings and associated meanings to the spaces. And then from that, there's also, with the returning shop owners, there's changing nuances of running the shops, even for the returning shop owners. And we'll talk about that as well. So this is a product of, I'll just move this around here. So this is the network that I got from the interview and all the interviews and all the data I've attempted to record. So if we focus on the one on the left, we can see that there are three main markets. Obviously, there are more spaces of memory, but if we look at purely commercial spaces, there are three main markets, and they all had associated meanings and memories attached to them. So for example, this market here, Bab al-Sarai, it had meanings of daily interactions, it had historic significance, and it had the production of items, because it hosted blacksmiths and carpenters. And it's then heavily connected with the Najafi Street, which is another shop, another market that is specialized for bookshop selling. And because it's mostly for bookshops and school-related items, it was mostly associated in the interviews with an event of starting the academic year, for example, or buying books later to the exam date by students. And then we have the last shop, the third shop here, which is the Serj Khana market, and that sells mostly women-related items like clothing and uniform for girls for school. So it's also connected to the Serj Khana. So in a way, they're all really interconnected, because while Bab al-Sarai provides grocery shops, so Najafi Street has books, and then this has female-related items. So it's all interconnected in an itinerary. However, during the post-war settings, only Bab al-Sarai has returned. Najafi Street has not returned yet. There are only a few shops on the north, the north side of it. And then the Serj Khana is just now starting to be reconstructed. But if we look at the network, is now far less interconnected. So an itinerary from Bab al-Sarai to the Serj Khana will take longer because of the kind of the abandonment of a Najafi. And that's really compromising how the people interact with the city. And also the less options, for example, the non-returning shop owners, even in the Bab al-Sarai, are causing locals to go more towards to the left side and purchase their needs from there. So really just a change in the built environment is changing all of these aspects from why people go there and how they interact with the city. And this is a part of the documentation. So I started to look at where the shop owners have left. So for example, in the Serj Khana, in the top stories, there were doctors. So there was a complex of doctors, and they have all emigrated to more permanent, newly expanded spaces in the other coast of the city. And as we can see here, this is kind of a more modern complex in comparison to the older ones. And this is more permanent, and they have no intention of really coming back to the old town. And that kind of leaves this space to be abandoned and not invested in due to its physical state. And this can be applied to others. So in here, I kind of spatialize where everyone have went. This is their locations in the old town. And these are the sporadic locations in the left side. So as we can see here, it's not only about changing locations, but also the proximity of their locations in the original spaces against how sporadic they are in the left side, which really disconnects and disbands that community that was created in the old town over generations. And more on the architectural fronts, there are multiple cases of historic elements and architectural elements in the city. So I will just mention this one because for me, it's the most interesting one, which is a window grill that's created by a local generational artisan. And that artisan has a no welding technique. So all of this is made without any welding involved. And this is unique for the city of Mosul. You cannot see it in any city around the city of Mosul because it's created by the artisans of the old town, the blacksmiths that have been there for generations and now have been disappeared in a way. So newly developed buildings by the UNDP are not using that. They're just using mass-produced window grills, as we can see here. So this can be then applied on more elements, like for example, the first stone, which is a handmade decorated arch that is very famous in Mausolean houses. Now it's being replaced by this very generic decorations, and the colors of the city in general are now being more colored and built and rebuilt with colors, which is another interesting aspect in the post-war because they want to breathe life into the neighborhoods, but that's another research to be undertaken. So this is an aspect of the itineraries in pre and post-war. So for example, and this is an itinerary of a person that just, for example, came from the left side of the city, from a surrounding village, and they just came to the old town. So they would, for example, go to the Bab al-Sarai, and this is all of this data is recorded from participants that have talked about where people go when they come from outside the city. Oops, sorry. And they would go, for example, to the Bab al-Sarai as a beginning, and then they will have lunch here where they sell grilled fish, and then they would go to the Corniche Street, and they would go back. Or if it's the start of the new year, the new academic year, they would go to Najafi Street, and then they will either use the alleyways to go to the Search Khana or use their the main routes. But now the station has been destroyed. So even if they do come, they will come from the bridge, and then they will only find the Bab al-Sarai market, and they will have the Search Khan, and there's nothing more to do in the old town. Therefore, they're finding more alternatives in the other side of the city. And as we can see, it's not as walkable of a distance. So they will have to hire a car, and they will have to navigate between the spaces. So this really distances them from the community. But there's more to that than just the patterns of movements and the proximity, because I keep mentioning the word community over and over, but that's not because it's not just a word to make my presentation look fancy, but it's there when I try to analyze the narrow scale of the buildings in the old town. So on the left here, we have a picture of Bab al-Sarai, and when analyzing Bab al-Sarai's spaces, we can see that it's narrow and it's high. So if we have X in the width, we have 1.5X in height, which that really allows for the communication between the shop owner and the customer and the local. And they have more conversations than just the interaction with the regarding the business. They talk more about their daily lives and the events that happen there. And similarly, in the first stories here, we can see that there are storage rooms for the shops and for the shops themselves, and that really amplifies when we look at more kind of hands-on production-oriented crafts like carpentry, for example, where carpenters I have here found evidence that there's a first story to the carpenter's market, and there are alleyways that take you to the house behind the workshop, and then we have some evidence of outdoor activities like painting the wood after making it. And while talking, I talked to the carpenter that was there, and we talked about how his house was just behind the workshop, and it kind of provided this efficiency and less commuting time in post-war settings, and how he now has to commute all the way from the other side of the city and come back here. So even though his shop has returned to its original location, the nuances of running the market has now changed. And similarly, his workshop used to be in the basement, but now because of the destruction of the basement and the evolving of the craft of carpentry, he has now relocated his workshop to the left side. So in a way that his original location is now only for exhibition, but it's not actually creating the product there. He's just exhibiting his products there. And similarly, in the alleyways themselves, the narrow alleyways in the city allow for you to hear interactions inside the houses and hear each other talk, and that creates more that sense of community and kind of sticking together during the events, and kind of the unified fate. And we can see that communities, they don't come back individually, they come back in groups because they have that bonding that happened over the generations, and it's allowed by this built environment. So last kind of point I want to talk about is the support for the reconstruction. So there are two main players and NGOs in the reconstruction of the city. So I will not even count the government because they have offered virtually no help except for paving the streets. But we have the UNESCO that is trying to rebuild the landmarks, and we have the UNDP, which takes more of a hands-on approach. Is let's bring the people back and let's reconstruct their houses. And they are the ones responsible for painting the houses and doing these new elements I discussed earlier. But I want to focus mostly on the UNESCO. Because we have this very famous project called Reviving the Spirit of Mosul, and it's now being built, and there's some criticisms regarding the design because it's created by a team outside, they are not from Iraq, and there's a question of what is the spirit of Mosul. This project has shown that it's more than just the landmark. It's a network of interconnected things, and this is what needs to be considered when looking at the spirit of Mosul. So the findings for this research is that there's a direct connection between the restoration of historic landmarks and the initiation of the old town's generational practices, generational patterns of movements in urban spaces. This permanent displacement to Al-Aysar allows for a change to the authentic historic identity of the old town spaces and culture, and is escalated by the lack of comprehensive reconstruction plan. Changing patterns of movements may have the potential of deciding the fate of the city as they aid in creating new trends and destinations in a changing built environment. And lastly, steps in advancement in the old town should consider a bottom-up approach that engages all stakeholders at governmental and non-governmental levels to reinitiate the economic growth and status of the old town. This begins with the shop owners themselves to understand the requirement for returning and the incentives for remaining in Al-Aysar. All whilst considering the normal patterns of change, like that workshop that I talked about, because the machinery has got bigger, so he has to move to the left side. So these are not caused by war, but just this is the pattern of change for the craft itself. So that was my presentation. I hope you liked it, and I look forward to receiving your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very good timing. I was about to get the red background.
I know.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I have a lot of questions. We'll keep it to the end with our colleagues. I'll first go back to the original background. And here. Yes. And now our next speaker is Pakinam Zaid. I would, Pakinam, please come on board and share your screen. Pakinam Zaid is a master's student and teaching assistant at the Department of Architecture, Alexandria University. Her most recent publication is titled Concomitant for one region delineating Batavia, victim and valedictorian. Her research pertains to study of politically driven architecture and urban morphology. She's a co-author for an upcoming book, Alexandria Architecture Guide, dedicated to the study of the ancient city of Alexandria, Egypt, and its rich heritage. So thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I am very privileged to be present amongst the very brilliant panelists. And there has been a lot of changes from when I wrote this short bio about myself. I had just attained my master's degree, so right now I am a master's degree holder. And the book that you have just mentioned that it's in the works, it's actually published. And if anyone would like to check it out, it's now available on Amazon. And I have now become an assistant lecturer at Department of Architecture. Firstly, let me just thank the previous presentations. Firstly, Dr. Ahmed Al-Khouli, when he spoke about human capital and innovation and creativity, which serves as a very, very nice intro to my paper as well. And according to Yusuf al-Dafa'i, when he spoke about dispossessed communities, which is basically a euphemism for the word diaspora or diaspora, the word is complicated, but really it speaks about refugees, dispossessed communities, etc. And lastly, when he reached the end, when he spoke about this project directed by UNESCO, the winning team actually is led by a professor who had sadly passed on a few months ago, Professor Salah ad-Din Haridi. He was brilliant professor, and yeah, he used to teach at our faculty, so yeah. Anyways, without further ado, the title of the paper is Diaspora Praxis to Modern Day Globalized Context. I'm just going to start off with a simple breaking down of the title, because come to think of it, when it's read, there aren't many syllables, but definitely lots of keywords. Highlighted is diaspora, which is the subject of discourse or of the paper in a broad sense. The globalized context, and there's praxis, which is the medium that conjoins both of them. We're going to start off talking about the diaspora phenomenon, which is basically the immigrant culture, refugees, basically migrants in search of a better life quality elsewhere. And when we talk about this phenomenon today, it's going to be tackling the cultural and urban milieu, and its impact on those. The words identity, sense of belonging, placemaking, citational, politics, gray areas, who's in and who's out, what belongs to whom, in terms of property, normative stasis granted by authorities, planning and host citizen assimilation policies. And then there's the destination or setting through which this phenomenon and all its spatial and cultural practices take place, the globalized context. And let us pause here for a second and redefine what globalized stands for, because this is what the paper will attempt to do: redefine, rearticulate, and speak of different renditions of culture, tradition, and globalization in terms of architecture, sense of belonging, and identity. Because often when we speak of globalization, it sometimes alludes to mass fabrication, loss of identity, homogeneity of practices, spatial, social, and cultural, basically the de-pedestaling of cultural norms and tradition. But let us stop there and talk about globalization in a different light. Let us talk about the global to mean trespassing and transgressing of geopolitical borders, and to effectuate urban connectivity rather than local and global dichotomy. To discuss the underlying tissue that binds all urban contexts, and that is the people as active agents and couriers of the cultural tool bag, as if you will, and constantly unpacking and adding of different variables to what we render fixated and unwavering to become more flexible and timely. Culture, heritage, and placemaking, which brings us to the argued praxis. Arriving at the outline of the presentation, firstly tackling the isomorphism between culture and architecture, then moving on from there to diasporic communities and their impact to the environments cohabited and cultures rearticulated, then arrive at both the domains and actors of the phenomenon, the diasporic communities and their recipients assimilating and excluding. How can we perceive the non-place urban realm focus on connectivity rather than fixated hurdles of tradition, shift from the dichotomization of Western and non-Western, places being submitted into nostalgic memories and timeframes, unmovable entities, which brings us to weak heritage. What is weak heritage, and how can we move beyond the weakness of such a conventional doctrine? Which brings us to the next open goal and speculation. What are cultural melting pots? An urban model suggested by one urbanist and architect, Aysar Arida, when bespeaking cultures cohabitating. Displayed are urban models suggested by urbanist and architect Aysar Arida when bespeaking cultures cohabitating in urban context. The one on the left is what Arida calls a melting pot effect, where the main urban character fades the effect of the others. While the urban model on the right, Arida calls mosaic juxtaposition, is where every character of a community is existent but doesn't interfere with the other, and hence social cohesion is unrealized. Which brings us to our final and open question: how can we employ and realize cultural responsiveness, sociospatial justice in the syntax of the built environment? Right, so let us steer on to the isomorphism between culture and architecture, understanding cities as more than just backdrops, which requires a path-dependent perspective where architecture and aesthetics are borers of more than meets the eye, values and the quality of life therein. A book by Stuart Brand highlights this medium and open weave through which buildings morph by adopting different values and tenets, us as inhabitants and passerby of architecture. How the same two buildings can bear more one meaning, evolve throughout time and human politics, and thus demolishing fixated and often romantic envelopes we sometimes procure and curate architecture and heritage to belong to. Palladian and architectural Edens, moving on from history and tradition to adapt and constantly morph from mere facts into living and communal experiences. Delving into the nuanced frameworks of understanding, which puts the whole diaspora culture into perspective, as the modern day globalized context has morphed throughout the dynamism of demographic movements, throughout colonialism, post-colonialism, human capital, and the creative milieus discussed by Richard Florida, as environments that implement and nourish tolerance as one of the fundamental indicators of human capital, and thus improved urban and economic performance. An agenda that's been adopted by a myriad of cities since the 1970s through the creation of creative milieus, museums, to the inauguration of culture and creative clusters that encourage communication and knowledge spillover. The urban fabric and the argued globalized context has become indiscernible in terms of East and West, Western and non-Western architecture to allow them to be hybrids and to coexist in one urban plateau. And that is where and well will become more aware of the changeability and flexibility of cultural and spatial practices. Portrayed is a Tamil worshipping temple in London, which manifests the English tolerance towards such architecturally affluent character and protruding motifs of the Tamil identity, which helps the diasporic community in London to feel more at home in the host city and thus have more established roots and sense of belonging. And with this new put and tolerant perspective, let us steer back to Aysar Arida's two urban models and how hybridization and newly established sense of identity and belonging can be tackled. He introduces this model of pluralism where a new overall identity based on mutual recognition doesn't dilute or jeopardize the mother cultures, but develops a mutual expression that belongs simultaneously to all of them. Urban endeavors that highlight and underline the racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically diverse have been employed in a myriad of articles and design courses that preach towards the rearticulation of culture and identity and therefore urban design, amongst which is the endeavors of urban ethnography, prioritizing researchers' roles biased towards a new objective and understanding the world from a native's point of view, thus melding this fissure that exists between the social sciences and the physical indeterminism, These are the endeavors from a lab called Urban Ethnography Lab, where the attempt to map unmappables, or what they call counter mappings, through which subjectivity is more endorsed and cognitive mapping, fully deployed into the cartoons, initiating dialogue between the visualized outcome, the author, the reader, and the usage of media thereof, changing the way we see the world and thus how we assess it. What is weak heritage? Weak, ironically, is a strong word to describe such a taxonomy of values and built structure. So what can it possibly mean for heritage to be weak? According to Rautenberg's paper, Weak Heritage and Neighborhood in Contemporary Cities, Capitalism and Memories of Urban Utopias, a weak is the reduction of apparatus and the identifiable circulation of its meanings, rendering it unviable and unsustainable and thus weak. It is through this nostalgic utopia and set time frame that we choose to obligate architecture and urban plateaus to stay in. Are we threatening the very definition of heritage and placemaking? Similar to this endeavor is that of English planning borough commissions, ungranting a Sikh temple to take on its full architectural character in fear of its threatening the neighborhood integrity, and thus remain the fixated concept of architecture to merely become facades that respect a melting cultural pot, like that of Aysar Arida's urban model. And in this unsustainable cultural susceptibility, do we risk the continuum of the medium that brings culture and architecture together, which a Syrian architect speaks of virulently in her TED Talk, describing an urban context that no longer reflects the inhabitants' collective identity, can wage wars based on lost sense of identity, lost sense of belonging, and infringed social cohesion as a result of urban gentrification and loss of urban vitality that brings a collective sense of belonging and prompts us awareness of the conclusive framework this research aims at. The importance of mapped and realized social cohesion and socio-spatial justice, shifting our attention from cultural difference to cultural contact, arriving at re-articulated notions of culture and globalized contexts. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation covering so many topics. We now move to our last speaker today. Lindsay, can you please come forward and share your screen? Lindsay.
Hi, Amir. Yeah, sorry. Trying to do these other little administrative tasks while also doing it. Yes, just give me 1 second. I'll turn on my camera.
Okay, so let me introduce you. I know everyone here knows you by now, but Dr. Lindsay Deaton is a licensed architect and urban planner with projects across the United States, the Middle East, and Far East and Africa. She serves as the Associate Director of the Urban Design Lab at the University of Oregon, where she recently obtained her doctorate. Her current research is an international study of marginalized kids' social spaces in communities affected by architectural mega projects in order to reconcile urban patterns and policies with kids' spatial needs. So Lindsay, the floor is yours and you have 23 minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amir. Appreciate it. There is so much to this work than what I'm able to cover in the presentation. So I hope that this just really whets your appetite for the paper overall. I'm also excited to report that since I submitted the abstract, this project won the Environmental Design Research Association's Great Places Research Award for quality and relevance. This work took the course of about 4 years, in which I lived off and on in Hyderabad, India, which is a culturally rich city of about 9 million people. And like so many places at IASTI that we investigate, Hyderabad has growing pains, like our session is titled, from globalization, and I think it really has some impacts on sense of tradition. So I like to use the analogy that Cyberbad, where my case is located, is really a symptom of those growing pains. Now, Cyberbad is a large development of special economic zones for IT and finance companies on the periphery of Hyderabad, India. It was planned to leapfrog Hyderabad into the professional services sector, following design precedents of Malaysia's cyber corridors and San Francisco's Silicon Valley through the neoliberal distribution of government resources. In the process of progress, however, there were 17 local villages that were dispossessed of their land. Now, in the paper, I focus on the story of 2 of these dispossessed villages, Rajiv Nagar and Nanakrem Gura, and I seek to illuminate the daily lives of children who live there. But obviously in this presentation, I'm only going to be able to cover one of those case studies because of time. And the presentation contributes, I think, to what's kind of more of a well-established discourse on the neoliberal regime of dispossession. Now, much of the discourse on dispossession has been dedicated to displacement and resettlement, but I really try to demonstrate how the dispossession framework can be applied to gentrification. There is tension in the idea of dispossession. You've got promoters on one side that argue that it's like a necessary evil, it's going to bring in jobs, it's going to stimulate the economy. But then on the other side, you've got critics, and they challenge that those benefits don't actually ever trickle down to the city's marginalized residents, just like the villagers in these areas. There's scholars like Jamie Cross, Michael Levine, and Anamika Singh. Anamika actually presented at IASTI 2018 in Coimbra. And they've refused this kind of back and forth dialectic. And instead, they've argued for a more complex understanding of dispossession that's grounded in the spatiality and the built environment. And so I'm really latching on to their ideas. And I leverage Levine's definition of dispossession as a social relation of coercive redistribution. But unlike Levine, I apply the concepts to the context of children. Now, children have been understudied throughout the academy, but they really offer a unique perspective on the spatiality of dispossession. I mean, they are typically integrated members of a village community, and they have spatial agency, but they have high stakes in the viability of public space, and yet they don't have the permission to directly participate in most of the politics or even in the economy. So I think their voice was especially critical to represent this kind of marginalized class. So I focus on how children, specifically I'm looking at adolescents, play in these dispossessed villages. Oh, let me go back one. So I did this by pairing the oral history of each village, focusing on the ways in which the elders remember playing and how spatial changes have occurred with current observations and behavior mapping of children's play spaces. In the paper, I answer questions like, how has public space that was previously used for play been compromised? And then how do children play in these communities today? In order to contribute to that ongoing discourse of how dispossession processes under distinctly neoliberal policies reproduce spatial inequality. In the discourse on children's play spaces, the notion and expectations of play are not normalized. They really vary across different cultural contexts. So in this study, the general expectations were developed through ethnographic fieldwork, just like Pakinang had just said, and interviews with social organizations and school staff in the communities. Play, I define as a social activity in which children engage for enjoyment and recreation rather than for serious or productive purposes. And generally in these communities, the traditional means of play, which is based on memories and the expectations that family members have, require safe, open spaces, but they don't require equipment or toys or any kind of like direct supervision. Now, in this paper, I only engage a subset of data, as I said, from my dissertation, which was a larger ethnographic research project. While I relied mostly on these kind of 14 interviews with community representatives or the elders, and about 52 hours of observations and mapping, I can't really completely separate out the experience that I had as a researcher from the larger project. And so I've tried to integrate some key points and quotes of the larger data set when it really colored how I interpreted the data overall. After I analyzed the interviews that I did with the teenage residents in these villages, I identified 13 possible public spaces across the two communities. Again, I'm just going to talk about Nanakrem Guda, which you see in the image on the right. And the space types included streets with shops on them, alleys between houses, abandoned lots, pasture lands or open spaces, and temple grounds. I wanted to touch a little bit on behavior mapping specifically, though, because it was the primary source of data that I rely on for the paper. Many of you guys know it, but it's an objective observation method that's commonly used in urban design and architectural projects. In fact, it's one of the core research methods that I teach along with Mark Gillum in the class Human Context at the University of Oregon. In this study in particular, I focus on children's play spaces, so it's place-centered observations. And I basically record all the different use behaviors over a period of time in each place through a very tailored, systematic way of diagramming and drawing and annotations. So my research team and I went to each of these sites. We conducted 4 observation sessions in 1-hour blocks, so 4 hours total, in 15-minute increments, using behavior mapping to document the patterns of use in each space. We developed the map legends based on criteria that we thought were relevant from the interviews. So gender, age, mode, and direction of travel. And we applied that consistently across all of the spaces. So I've also made extensive field notes and sketches during the observation periods that helped my understanding and recollection as I kind of compressed all of these behavior maps together. Nanakrem Guda Village, the case study that I'm going to talk about, is an example of gentrification along the spectrum of dispossession. While the village remains unmoved, it's the only link by the memory of surviving residents to the old agricultural village dating back to some 400 years. Walking down the main street, I could really see the effects of market forces and a completely shifting demographic on the historic village architecture. What were once single floor, low slung, clay tile roofed farmhouses have been replaced with concrete, mid-rise, paying guest towers that have parapet roofs that residents can dry their laundry on. The old houses with outbuildings that have for cooking and bathing and storage have really been enclosed by concrete walls that effectively create a semi-private courtyard, while the new towers have more space-efficient exterior stairways that pour directly out into the street, but it really limits the public domain. This architectural juxtaposition was really accented with walled off lots and tiffin vendors and street level shops overall. As told in separate interviews with some of the village elders, Rutvik and Balraj have changed their names, obviously, to protect their privacy. They are the former and current heads of the village, respectively. It was originally comprised of Lota caste people who migrated from Aurangabad to Hyderabad to be guards for the Nizam generations ago. Under a feudalistic-like Jaigiri system, the families were given land to cultivate. And as the state then transitioned to independence in the mid-20th century, the area was then set to be managed by a waif board with little disturbance to the day-to-day life. Some of the farmers had what they called a loni pata, which means they were assigned lands, but not really given title. And Balraj said, I quote, "as was the way," end quote, when I asked him if he had any real formal documentation. Then in the early 1900s, Vijay Nirmala started shooting some films in the area. And then shortly after, producer Ramanadu purchased 40 acres and built the Ramanadu Film Studios on lands that were directly adjacent to the village. Now, I feel like this is a really key point because the purchase of the land was viewed favorably by Ritvik and Balraj because they knew that the farmers had been compensated well for the land. Balraj noted specifically, quote, 40% over market value in talking about what he was paid. However, that contrasts with the land grabs of the early 2000s, in which Chief Minister Chandrababu Naidu, or CM Naidu, gave notice to the occupants that several hundred acres of land in Nanakrem Gouda were going to be taken by the government without compensation, even for the few farmers who had title. With bitterness, Ritvik noted that only the film studios were compensated during the land grab because he believed that they belonged to the Telugu Desam party and had family connections to the funding Congress in power. Now, PATA holding members of the community took their case to the Supreme Court, showing how important this rift was. At the time of the field work, which was nearly 20 years after the land grab, most of it has been allocated to the Telangana State Industrial Infrastructure Corporation as part of the Nanakrem Gouda IT Park, a special economic zone. Some of the land has been developed for multinational corporations, and the rest lies vacant but enclosed or inaccessible to farm, and no official court settlement has actually passed. Despite the intense commercial and infrastructure development in the neighboring special economic zone, the remaining village still lacks basic public infrastructure like a primary health center. There's no library, there's no community hall or ground, or even really drainage infrastructure. And when I asked about the contrast between the neighboring special economic zone and then the village's lack of infrastructure, the local corporator, Aluva Satyanarayana, blamed an extreme lack of municipal funds to the extent that he can't even replace the few damaged streetlights that are there on the main road. Against the memory of a childhood in which they played cricket in the fields, they climbed boulders and sang in the streets, the elders voiced concerns that today their children do not have the same opportunities. The village is enclosed by newly constructed highways and special economic zone compound walls, leaving it to grow only by increasing density and building upwards. For generations, villagers proudly farmed for a living, but now they only rely on service jobs, such as home guards or running tiffin centers and renting out rooms to the masses of migrant construction workers. Although a small community, there's not been any pathway programs or job trainings or employment set-asides for the villagers to ease that transition from the agriculture to service labor. Ritvik and Balraj shared similar figures of the population of residents that lived there. Of the local residents, they believe that about 70% are Lota caste, with scheduled castes and Muslims being the next two largest groups. And the remaining area is a mix of Reddy and other backward classes. They agree that few have been able to leave and buy farmland out farther of the city. So most of the 4,000 original villagers have stayed. A steady influx of over 8,000 migrant workers has completely changed the character of the community. The migrant workers are typically young men without families from the northern and eastern Indian states that live in rented dormitories. The increase in migrant construction workers, combined with the decrease in parents working in home, has raised real concerns about child safety, specifically for girls. The streets are no longer safe places to play, as they've been commandeered by migrant workers walking to and from the nearby job sites. Ritvik and Balraj expressed concern that their village had no place for children to play. During their term as political leaders, they've both repeatedly lobbied the local government, but were told each time that according to the city plans, Nanakrem Gouda had reasonable access to a playground in Kota Gouda. However, they disagreed because in practice, the Kota Gouda ground was 1.5 miles from Nanakrem Gouda on the other side of a 6-lane raised highway with no pedestrian pathways. It's not just the material concerns though, as Balraj said, quote, "Those people," referring to the people in Nanakrem Gouda, "do not like outsiders coming in and causing problems." Neither of them knew of any families who actually considered that ground a reasonable place for their kids to play. So where do kids play in Nanakrim Gouda if they don't go to the ground in Kota Gouda that's identified by the maps? The finding from the interviews with children suggested that there were a range of spaces outside of the home that held promise as public play spaces, even if they were only really public in practice, like in how they were used. So from these, I selected 3 specific sites to observe. I selected 4, but I'm only going to really talk about 2 in this presentation, which is an alley and the temple ground. So the paved alley reminded me on first instinct as a medieval town because really of the proportions of the narrow alley to a high balcony-filled wall of mid-rise towers on either side. And the narrowness, perhaps, was the main reason that the alley was not used for through traffic by four-wheelers like cars and trucks and was mostly for pedestrians and two-wheelers like bicyclists. The solar orientation meant that the alley was in the shade for most of the day. And so the expanse of concrete from the buildings held on to cooler temperatures, and it was a really nice respite from the hot summer sun. The alley had a few unique architectural features that I didn't find anywhere else in the village. First, there were large concrete plinths outside a few of the homes that adults and children regularly used to rest and engage with people on the street. This contributed to the street life as surveillance, as well as set a tone of relaxation. I found that they were often occupied by women living in the towers above. There were also 2 very narrow passages, like less than 2 feet wide, between towers that connected to the alley to a different lane. And these passages were honestly the favorite place for young children to run and hide and play with their friends. The towers also had occupiable balconies that were used throughout the day. In the mornings for airing out the bedding and then drying hair, and then for laundry, and for yelling down to children or traveling salesmen. I didn't witness any migrant workers on this lane. It really seemed to be a space in which women had more agency and spent most of their time, thus regulating the use of space. The second place was the Hanuman Temple. It was on the corner of the main street and a cross lane. While both aspects were deserved, the cross lane and the main street separately, neither place ended up being a place that children played. This temple area was consistently busy, and the cross lane was frequently blocked by patrons and parking cars. The temple was also the stop for the public bus, as well as many private school buses. Children who got off the bus either walked home with friends or were met by family members and escorted home. They were never left there alone. Shops lined either side of the temple on the main road and wrapped around the corner of the lane, slowly transitioning into the residential towers that were at the end of the blocks. The main road transformed in the evenings and became another space altogether from dusk to late evening. It was more than a bazaar. As the sun went down and the job sites let out, all of these migrant construction workers would fill the street, crowding out vehicular traffic. The main road became pedestrian only, with a number of vendors setting up the market. Out of the thousands of men that came to the street, I only ever saw perhaps 10 to 20 women, which were actually all vendors working their carts with their families. This gendered space pushed local villagers, and especially children, back into their homes. Deprived of safe and accessible public spaces to play, many parents have responded by not allowing their children outside of the home. The architectures of the newer middle and upper class housing complexes privatize internal play spaces as an architectural pattern. 3 of these complexes have encroached between the village and the SEZ. All of them feature privatized grounds and open spaces. They're heavily guarded, enclosed, and typically raised above ground level. These spaces are inaccessible, though, to the locals. While nostalgia can be really problematic, obviously as a direct comparison, I do think that the descriptions tell of anticipations and cultural expectations that parents have of their community and their community spaces. Further, other scholars like Claire Risbeth and Mark Powell found that, quote, personal meanings contribute to effective bonds between people and place, end quote, based on memory studies they did with migrant communities and public space. So their work really underscores an important role that memories of childhood play in the attachment elders and leadership have to the public space in their community. As development impacts community spaces and it transforms the architecture, these nostalgic connections are ruptured and anticipations left unfulfilled. In interviews, Parents consistently anticipated that urbanization would result in their children having a similar, if not better, quality of space for play. Anthropologist Jamie Cross explored the dream and desired futures that compromise, maintain, and interrupt capitalism in present-day India by studying the dispossessed families in nearby Visakhapatnam. He found that it's both the anticipation and the continuous delay of hopes and dreams and expectations of urbanization that have actually come to define capitalism. In these communities, the value of urbanization is largely vested in uneven opportunities for livelihood and progress. Stories of fulfilled dreams rest with families who have legitimate property rights as their area urbanized, while those without property rights were further marginalized. This violent urbanization disrupted traditional architectural patterns like narrow lanes, and it introduced new actors, such as migrant construction workers and heavy automobile traffic, that heightened the risk to children in previously innocuous spaces. Yet not all forms of urbanization affect residents in the same way. Under the regime of neoliberal capitalism, property rights exaggerate class inequalities by situating space as a speculative commodity in which most economically profitable use of space is rendered superior. Property rights are used to dispossess families occupying land without legitimate claims. Dispossession, as Levine stated, is a political apparatus for coercively redistributing land. And in Nanakrem Gouda, historically privileged caste, classes, and genders who have legitimate access and claim have been able to benefit from urbanization. But the underprivileged families who've been legitimately prohibited from claiming space in past have been dispossessed and spatially redistributed. Amir, it's my last slide. So children in these villages are sincerely concerned about their safety. The public spaces in Nanakrem Gouda have changed the ways that increase their risk. The actors have changed. There's foreign people who have regular access to previously intimate spaces. Vendors compete for public space to sell their goods, and there's dangerous vehicles that have been prioritized over the pedestrian walkways. The architecture has changed. Narrow alleys were widened, empty lots were developed, street vendors' carts encroached on the sidewalk. Largely in response to safety concerns, families with the financial means have either moved away or constructed solid concrete walls around their homes. However, even these solid walls have a compounding effect on the danger because they don't function as eyes on the street. While elders remember long games of cricket lasting days in empty fields, the observations and behavior mappings that I did showed that children today play gully cricket in narrow alleys and modified versions of Kho-Kho and Kabaddi without running far distances. But children are creative, and they've invented new ways of socializing and engaging with the new architectural confines as their domain decreases and new threats appear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Only 3 seconds over time, which is fine. Let me go to this. Okay, now I think we open for questions or discussions, and feel free to ask each other as the speakers. I have plenty of questions, but let's see if we, you can ask or add it to the chat. All right, I'm going to start with a question to Dr. Khouli. I was very fascinated with the presentation. And one thing came to my mind, since your sampling brought 50% people accepting the replica and 50% do not. And I think there is a more or less similar, a little bit more or less divide among the scholarly community. I was wondering what would be the government opinion here, or what would be the local government? Are these cities trying to be smart and engage with artificial intelligence, but they are unable in the Arab world, or they just don't want the official position of cities, where, especially the cities you mentioned?
Let me get the question straight. You're asking whether the government officials want their cities to be smart or not? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Do they want or not? Or they are unable to make them smart.
let me start first by saying that the study didn't include government officials, but some of those who responded to the question. This is one of the limitations about posting a survey on the internet, because you don't have control about who goes in. But it was a very purposive sample. It was not probabilistic, because where we posted the link for the survey and send it by email, we send it to people who are architects, urban planners, and some of them and the practitioners usually work for the government. So probably they are reflecting what they hear from their client. Now, they think, my gut feeling is that they want the smart city to be in the new developments, in the new cities. But old cities, they don't care about it. They don't care about the old city. I mean, if you go from Morocco all the way to in the MENA region, most of the feeling is about between putting new developments, something new, something, and you have those skyscrapers with glass and stuff like this. And they think that the smart city is all about we avail internet. And maybe we have surveillance to gather the information about, for security reasons, in the public spaces after the 2011 events that took place, so-called the Arab Spring. So I don't think that they care about the cities or the heritage. I mean, you've been in Cairo and you've seen what happened in Sahara and Mamalik. And your friend Muhammad al-Khatib was doing wonders over there. So please, Yani, you know the answer more than me.
Yeah. My question was more about the Dubai and Qatar and Saudi, because they rank very high in trying to use artificial intelligence and virtual.
Okay, those countries are spending a lot of money in terms of networking, upgrading. I mean, G5 is everywhere now, Internet of Things like banking and stuff like this. But as I said, if you want a smart city, you need a smart citizen. In a paper before, Ghada and I worked about the smart sustainable cities published in Open House International. And one of the findings was that people, and based on Alexa and the hits from the Arab region, all of them go to movies, YouTube for movies, or about soccer. And that's why most of the Arab countries are not among the top on the scale for the Global Innovation Index. In the Middle East, including Israel and Iran, Turkey, the study showed that only Israel is in the list of those who are contributing and doing something about innovation and technology. The rest, they buy the technology. They don't do it.
Yes, that's.
And that's what I'm saying in the presentation. We wrote it in the paper. You need to develop the education system and research, scientific research, in a way that you do your own technology. How many times did you try to get an Arabic package for a software, but they don't have it because no one might use the software or the application? It happens in several, like for example, the SPSS doesn't work with Arabic.
Sad, but
thank you, Amir.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Any other questions to Dr. Kholi in the audience? Because I have a couple of questions here for Yusuf. Let's see if anyone posted in the chat. You guys can unmute yourself or just post the question in the chat box. Until then, so Yusuf, you talked about the intangible and the relocation or the shift or the deposition of people. I was wondering if you encounter any intangible culture or art or music that were not affected by the relocation, things that are not based, not place-based, where can be things, could be talents, could be music, could be food, cooking, something that is will not be impacted by that, so it becomes worth highlighting and worth preserving. And the other question is about if that evacuation of the cultural area can be an opportunity to redevelop it, since the relocation already have happened. Could that be an opportunity for local government, also international community, as you mentioned, UNESCO and UNDP, and as I know, doing a lot of work there? Would that be a possibility to have a blank canvas to redevelop it or rebuild it the way it should be? What are your thoughts on these two things?
Right. Thank you for the questions. I think both of them are very brilliant, and I will definitely include them in the final paper as well. Regarding your first question about what kind of is non-location based, because I know most of the stuff that I was focusing on is how they are location based and they have been displaced and what's the fate of their original locations. But there are things that obviously cultures take with them. So wherever you go, it's a part of your identity as a person. And I think some things regarding that have to do also with the community. So displaced communities, like I said, they have kind of immigrated together to the other side of the city. And with that, they took their daily interactions and activities with them. For example, you have in Ramadan, there's so much food exchange and greetings and visits, and they still happen. So participants have been very happy with that, the fact that they are still have the same neighbors, albeit in a different place, and they have continued their daily interactions with their neighbors. But they still complain with the fact that, for example, right now in the old town, pre-war old town, kids just, for example, you would have the neighbor's kids in your courtyard and no one would pay attention to them because they would just run between the houses, and it's all allowed by the narrow alleyways that I mentioned. So right now, although they still have these kind of non-locational interactions, like you mentioned, like greetings, visits, and the food exchange, and the Ramadan traditions and the Eid traditions, but it's not enabled as much by the built environment. So while they are there, they could be reduced by the built environment. And obviously there will be stuff that have been completely, not like food, for example. It's not exclusive to the old town, it's exclusive to Mosul. So even though they immigrate to the other side of the city, they still have the food. And this is still there. So for example, you will have the restaurants that will in the old town, they just immigrated to the left side, but they still have serving the same food with the same recipe. So we still have that. And I think, like you mentioned, this is a very good point, and it's worth preserving as well and pinpointing that. Regarding your second question, it's very multidimensional, and I think we should start with the question of what kind of development do we want in a place as history rich as the old town, and because it doesn't seem to satisfy anyone. So, for example, the UNDP, although they are helping people come back, but they're only funding people with partially destroyed homes. For example, if one wall is destroyed or something like that, they would help with that. And the UNESCO have their own agendas in reconstructing, like there's a certain criteria. So what do we want them to restore in the markets, and who's going to restore that? I think these are two key questions to ask before that. So for example, you have the Najafi Street, which is privately owned by the ex-shop owners. And some of them are owned by the endowment office, the Sunni endowment office. We call it the Waqf in Arabic. And they have their own agendas for reconstructing, and they just want any investment. And right now they are being sold for the highest bid. So there's an auction for that, and there's no guidelines for what these shops have to be. So effectively, I can go to a historic market, buy a shop and sell phones, even though that shop used to sell books, for example. So it's really allowing for that change. So I think setting a guideline for what kind of development do we want in the old town is the baseline for starting, because we have to set the zones and then see who's going to take action in these zones. I hope that answers this question. I know it's very multidimensional.
It does. It got a new question in my mind about people local people will and support, and if they are engaged in a participatory manner in deciding what to, in answering that. But just for the sake of time, I would pose my questions a bit and go to Pakinam, who wants actually to ask you. So Pakinam, why don't you, I see a question, very nice one. Why don't you just unmute yourself and ask him so all the audience can hear it? Go ahead, please.
Great. Thank you. Yusuf, hello, first of all. Thank you for your research. You mentioned that you had spent 3 weeks in Mosul, and you mentioned trials to collect data to be carried out in your research. And so you also mentioned ethnographic efforts. So if you don't mind telling us more about the ethnographic efforts, how were they carried out? And if they had helped you at all to visualize maps using such material means like that of ArcGIS. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that question. I wish I could cover all of that in the presentation. I only had 20 minutes and I was just on edge with the time, and I was just freaking out for the last 3 minutes. But I think that's a brilliant question. I think with the ethnographic observation, especially that, just wanted to disclose that I'm from Iraq. I'm not from Mosul, but I've never seen Mosul before this site visit. In my lifetime. So while I had a very good understanding of the spaces of the city by listening to the locals speak in the pilot study interviews, I had no actual understanding of what the space looks like in person. So I thought that the first thing I need to do when I go there is try to pinpoint where the people go to. So I went there without maps. I didn't pull out my phone. I didn't get the maps with me because I wanted to immerse myself and really just start from the bridge that takes you to the old town and see where the people would go. So I had stations, and I have a map for that, but I didn't put it in the interview. I had stations of where I kind of stopped and looked at where people go and where they come from. And then I will then go ahead and to the other place of interest of where the people would come and go from. And then I would also go to the abandoned space, like for example, the Najafi Street, and see why do people bypass it, and how do they use it right now with it being completely unused commercially. So it's based on spaces, and I stay for around an hour in that space, observe where people go and what they do in these spaces, and then move on to the other station that I had no idea. And then luckily it just came to a full loop. I wasn't lost in the old town. I came with full loop because after the Search Khan, I saw, oh, that's the bridge that I just came from. So I just walked back there. But I thought that with that, there was some kind of, I couldn't isolate myself from the issue. So I think I took more of an auto-ethnographic approach rather than ethnography. It was kind of like Lindsay's approach to the situation. So you kind of, when your emotions really come into play, and you kind of, you can't have a neutral eye to the project in a way. So I think then the second part of the question with the ArcGIS, yes, so basically I started to visualize these stations on the ArcGIS and then contrast that against what the people have said it's important to them, and see are the places that I've been there as a new person the same as the people mentioned, and they found that they stated that it's important to them. So are all the places that visible places to a newcomer, or are there more hidden places in the city? And I found that there's a kind of a mixture of both. So we have the more kind of visible spaces that you would definitely go to when you first go to the old town, and there are more hidden ones. I hope that answers the question.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a comment from Dr. Kholi. Please go ahead. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Amir. I have one comment. I mean, the first comment on my list is not just for us as the presenters, but also for the several sessions that I attended about the change that takes place and the loss of culture and loss of identity. And I think we have to look into the institutional setup of managing the cities, and in terms of the economics that takes place because I always see that there is a kind of a contradiction between the market value or the market value and the use value. What does the building for Yusuf now? He's attached to it. He thinks about it in a very emotional way, while the people who own the building, they only see the price of the real estate. Now, because we don't have a proper institutional setup to manage that market, that's why you see those changing and the land uses and demolishing buildings with characters, and the identity of the city is changing, reflecting the chaos that the new liberal movement and the globalization is bringing to our settlements. The second comment also, it's about in the qualitative research, the researcher, as in the case of Yusuf here, is the tool, is the research tool. In quantitative, we look into the questionnaire itself or the data and the validity and reliability of the data, because it will affect the results. Now, he already acknowledged his bias, and that's an issue or a limitation that has to be said up front first. And in the light of that confession, let me say, he explains the limitation or how he has seen the problem. See what I mean? That's a real, because that's a point you will find it with people who are not working with the qualitative methodologies. So the issue of the validity and reliability of the data, because it will affect your results and the findings and the discussion. Last comment is for Yusuf. When you mentioned about the interaction between these different markets, there is a model that we know about. It's called the gravity model, where you want to see who is, I mean, it's usually used in transportation planning, where you see where the areas of origin for the trips and the destination. And then there is about the size of the populations in the two areas and about the number of cars, and then how many trips are done. So you can see where, who goes where. And they use it. There are some extensions on the ArcGIS. Maybe if you can get some data on the people, where they come, where to which market, at what time, that will give you more understanding and validity to the data, the analysis that you're doing. I'm just suggesting. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Amir.
Thank you, Dr. Kholi. Before I move to Pakinam, I want to add that comment to the last comment. If you apply the origin destination or the gravity model in GIS, beware of social biases, and you might find specific patterns that needs further digging deeper and explanation, which might not be the core of your, which might not be the exact core of your research, but we are all interested in what you do because it's very complex. It has an urban and social dimension, and it's a very successful research. Anyway, we have hands up, Lindsay. Oh, Yusuf, I still haga. Go ahead.
We're engaged now, Amir.
I quite like this conversation, but Lindsay, you raise your hand first. You want to go first?
Lindsay, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I just I wanted to kind of retort, Ahmed, respectfully to your second point about acknowledging a bias, and I think that terminology, maybe I'm being too picky, but I think that terminology really applies quantitative processes to qualitative, and I don't know that it's appropriate. I think that the goal in qualitative work is to be the researcher and to have your subjective experience and interpret the data. It's intended to be filtered because there's that acknowledgement that there's no such thing as being unfiltered, right? All the people you're working with have, as you mentioned in your first point, economic goals or maybe political goals. And so I think as a qualitative researcher, you go in knowing that everybody, you as well as everybody you talk to, every source of data is filtered for a very specific and strategic way. And it's your job to then really use triangulation to find the rigor and find the evidence, making sure that you have multiple sources, making sure that you're hearing the same thing from multiple people, but also using like ArcGIS or using some sort of second or third or fourth research source, data source to confirm or deny. So I think that this is kind of like I'm just picking on you, Ahmed, but I think for me, this is something that I get a little frustrated with when I talk about qualitative work, especially in my institution, because I think that there's an assumption that the same use of, or the same reasons for credibility and trustworthiness can be applied from quantitative to qualitative. And I think that our language around it needs to be adapted a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, if I made that comment hoping to hear your response. I know what you're saying. I'm playing the devil's advocate.
Great. Okay.
Because I have the same problem with the folks in my department. It's the natural resources. All of them come from science and engineering. And if they don't see a regression or a table in a paper, that's not science for them.
All right, I'll go to Yusuf wanted to comment, then Mark.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Lindsay kind of mentioned almost the same point that I wanted to take, but I just wanted to say that even my thesis, I tend to not use the term qualitative. Instead, I use a set of interpretative methods, which is kind of, it's a parallel in a way, but it really highlights the fact that it's not about what I'm getting at. It's more about how do I interpret it and what is that. So for example, the unconscious bias, or in this case conscious bias, it's not a limitation, but rather it's something to interpret. It's something to understand the reasons for and why it's that way, and how is that going to direct some of the semi-structures of you. So everything in a way, everything it's a set of data to be interpreted. It's not to be counted in a way. But it's just a very quick kind of comment.
Thank you, Yusuf. Now we go to Mark. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I think it was around 1891. The quote, "lies, damn lies, and statistics" was popularized, and it wasn't until Mark Twain kind of referenced that. So whether we're thinking qualitative, quantitative, interpretive, there's always individual reading into this. So Yusuf, as I looked at your presentation, which was fantastic, and really the ability to get the images, to hear the stories, and to make the maps was tremendous. And they were beautiful maps. But those are maps based on your interpretation, right, of Mosul, and your read of how people can get to and from places based on the conditions at the time. And those are constantly changing. So it's just, I think, the recognition that the researcher is always there in the place. And sometimes you can remove yourself as much as possible. Other times you can't. And I think bringing it back to the conference theme of the virtual, seeing how renderings and imagery can actually mask what's going on underneath, I think is interesting. Lindsay, in your presentation, which as always was very good, looking at the advertisements versus the reality. And I think there could be deeper digging into that area, what actually was the outcome, finding out who did those renderings and why, or the political motives and the economic motives. And how do people read those renderings? Because when you see the renderings, I think it was one of your last slides, you see these renderings of these glass towers, who's doing that and why, and who stands to benefit. And I think really kind of tying it to the virtual and then seeing what happened in the real is incredible. So nice work.
That's a great plug, Mark, for them to read my 800-page dissertation on the same subject.
There you go. Put a link to it in the chat box and then they can get it.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Since the conversation is going, I have a small question for
We also have a question in the chat box, Amir, from Stuart. I don't know if you saw that.
Well, which chat box? Are you on a different?
Here, I can read it out.
Please, go ahead.
Sorry, maybe he gave me a direct message. So this is from Stuart Birch. He has a question about research ethics. Did the speakers encounter problems when getting clearance to conduct work? This is particularly interesting when it comes to ethnographic fieldwork in zones of conflict, war, religion, economics, and involving vulnerable communities, especially children. How does one ensure informed consent, and what about your own personal safety? Yusuf, do you want to take that first?
I'm assuming that's, so Professor Gamal is here. He remembers the time of undertaking the ethics clearances from the Nottingham Trent University. And we had to go through rounds and rounds and rounds of revisions for the surveys and the interview questions, albeit they're semi-structured, but we still had to have a guideline for them. And we had to go through multiple iterations to ensure that it doesn't trigger trauma and it doesn't trigger any questions related to their war memories. So the idea is not inquiring about their experiences in the war. It's about asking them where they go to and what places they like. So if they choose to take it to their memories of the war, that's it's their preference, but the questions are designed to not trigger any of that kind of war memories. And regarding my own kind of safety, well, informed consent first. So yeah, we had the informed consent sheets and the participant had to be kind of informed by that and know their rights of withdrawal of their participations in the project. And they have my contact information should they want to withdraw at any time. And they know that their data will be anonymized and they will be hidden from their names will be hidden from the actual project, unless there are key informants where they want to be their credentials need to be established in a way. And regarding the safety, so the situation in Mosul right now, it's safe. They have cleared the old town from all the IEDs and the safety is more or less established. So when I went there, I had a chaperone as well. So from one of my pilot study participants has kindly volunteered to be there should I need him and chaperone me around the city if I needed him. So I really did that after the ethnographic observation. So yeah, that was from my side. I'm looking forward to hear from everyone else's sides.
Yeah, any other response to that specific question from other speakers?
Yeah, sure, I can jump in and work with kids. So pretty much similar to Yusuf, I had to take a bunch of training for child safeguarding, as well as working with children to make sure that all the materials were age appropriate, that there were specific guidelines in place. We had to get written confirmation of permission from a parent or legal guardian, as well as assent for the children to agree to the study, and those had to be gained at separate times. We had to have a certain period of duration where the family would consider whether they wanted to participate or not without any kind of consequence. This actually proved really challenging because in some of the communities I worked with that had, been displaced through government legal mechanisms, and especially having low rates of literacy, even though I had a translator there, there was a lot of distrust in the fact that I was an outsider putting a piece of paper and asking them to sign their name was just the whole process of that was considered very offensive. And I had to go through a rigorous process with my institutional review board to get them to agree that the participants shouldn't have to sign their name, that they could verbally assent, and that I would provide 2 witnesses that would then sign that they saw them say that it was okay, just to make the process less uncomfortable for the people that we were working with. We also found unfortunately, after one of the first villages that I worked with, that I needed to provide my research team with child trauma and abuse training. We found that when we were doing focus groups and providing kind of a safe space for kids and teens to get together and talk, that they often wanted, kind of like Yusuf said, we would never direct any question towards their experience. It was all about the architecture, but that they opened up and they wanted to talk about really traumatic things that had happened to them, and wanted somebody to intervene in their life. And so we had to have a very prepared process of how we would contact police and child service agencies, because that happened on a number of times. And you might think it's surprising because I wasn't in a war zone, but I did have issues of safety, actually. I did have an issue in which one of the communities that had been relocated and settled pretty far outside of the city, also having a lot of distrust. The community had kind of fractured into a group that wanted me there because they wanted their story told, and then a group that had decided that I was there for nefarious reasons. And so we tried to be pretty safe. I had a team of 3 students from a local university to provide kind of translation support, and we were only there during the daytime. But at one point, the group that was kind of unhappy with our presence circulated a rumor that we were kidnapping children. And so they actually came to one of the houses that we were working in with one of the families and kind of insisted that we come out and confront them and bring the child forward that had gone missing. Of course, we had nothing to do with that, but it really put into light kind of a village mindset and the dynamics of being an outsider and being a researcher and how precarious that situation was. And so that required us to think through, even though we were just doing work on where kids play, from us it seems innocent. There's a lot of kind of, when you're working with vulnerable people that are often marginalized, I think that your position as a researcher is not understood, and you have to, it's your job to be very careful in how you engage with that community.
Thank you very much. I have Mohammed Gamal. Go ahead, you have your hands up.
Yes, it was a commentary on the consideration for children in conflict zones, because this is quite very sensitive issue, and similar to what Lindsay mentioned, so that's why perhaps I forgot my hands up. But just as Yusuf mentioned, it had to go through cycle and piloting and looking at the perception of researchers, exactly what Lindsay mentioned, because you are a foreigner, and if you don't really understand the local dynamics and how people perceive different people, even within the community itself, have different perceptions and antagonization towards different groups. So there's a lot of politics at play to be considered. So it's not easy really to really advise and just jump on a plane and then land in some place. You need to understand the socio-political context and local balances to make sure that you are not really tapping into those ones and you are perceived as objective researchers. Because as Lindsay mentioned, there will be different perspective towards your research. Some people will be supportive, some will be against. And to really restrict yourself to certain perspectives because of accessibility to people and voices, that might really take part of the credibility of the research and its findings, and then becomes biased or not, let's say, objective enough. So I think such kind of conditions, in the very particular conditions, we try to really deal with every context in a different way. And I think the range of fantastic papers that has been shown on this panel shows a lot about how such situations are very carefully handled and what kind of great knowledge you can get out of it if you do it right.
Thank you very much. I will add half a minute on that. I had a student who works in Cairo in designing public spaces, and I was exposed to a lot of literature on designing for people who are in trauma. And believe it or not, Cairo has not been in a war, but there's a lot of Cairenes who are subject to that. So, and it has to do a lot with benches, circulation. Do people walk behind the bench or front of the bench? Do people want to be sitting and trees on their back or in their front? So that's something maybe for Yusuf to consider in his future work, if he's suggesting any new development or he become part of a team in a new development in this area. Because we have only 5 minutes, I'm going to throw 2 questions in, one to Pakinam and one to Lindsay, and then let them both answer. Pakinam, you had a lot of very complex concepts in your that I think if you had more time, probably unpacking them would make it easier for all of us. But I see here on your, which you probably didn't touch on a lot in your presentation, you talk about refugees and how countries locate them. Some countries allow them to engage in the community and be part of their citizens. But you say here other countries, unfortunately, assign unsafe and lower class jobs to migrants as they are in the country's eye. I was wondering if you have if you first think this is a government-led attitude, or is it an attitude by the local, the host country? Is it a trend that is official, or is it something that people do because they don't want that these incoming refugees compete in their job market or in their life? And the other question to Lindsay, I was wondering, actually two questions. One is about land tenure. To what extent do you think having title or land tenure correlate with the relocation? Does it matter at all? Does it have any significant weight, or people just relocate regardless of that kind of status? And the other thing you mentioned is about moving from agro business or farming to service. And I was wondering if with the urbanization and the industrialization and the development process, if we can call it that, are there other economic bases where farmers can shift rather than becoming civil servants or in the service sector? Thank you. 2 minutes each. Go ahead, Pakinam.
Firstly, thank you for your question. I think that, yeah, the presentation only showed like very brief reactions to which you aim your questions at. And so I want to say that this is really left to the host city rather than for like more of a national policy or like a policy making measure that's a trend somehow, or is it something that all countries have to deal with? Maybe the refugee status has become more acknowledged in authorities, and there are now design policies. For example, we can see this very vocal in Germany, where there were a lot of endeavors that tried to design spaces that would include both host citizens and displaced communities in multi-purpose refurbishments in cities in Germany. And I would say that the negative reaction would be that assimilation policies would refuse to grant perhaps maybe different architectural manifestations, saying or claiming that the neighborhood's integrity would be endangered. And I think that a lot of borough planning commissions would also argue the same. So really, I think it depends on how we perceive architectural integrity and how we deal with this demographic diversification that's a result of a globalized domain. I hope
Thank you very much. Thank you. Lindsay, in 1 minute, maybe.
Sure. To answer your first question, what's the relevance of land tenure on the cycle? Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think you have to understand a few things. One, that laws that govern property rights are new. We kind of take them for granted. Oh, well, he didn't own it. Well, 50 years ago, he couldn't own it because of his religion, his caste, his gender, etc. So when you add that to the fact that land tenure is a form, it's a generational issue, and it definitely feeds directly to the ability of the next generation to have opportunities to education and livelihood. I do think it matters, but then at the same time, the system takes away and gives legal land title in a very, they have it, they don't have it way. And so there's a lot of distrust. So I think a lot of the villagers would say it doesn't really matter because it'll be taken away in a few generations when their gender, class, et cetera, are considered not relevant. But I think the government would argue that it does matter because they're trying to enforce their legitimacy. The second part of the question on, is there another pathway for farmers? I would say it has all to do with access to education. What jobs they have, that should be, their choice, their different pathways, but I would say that access to education is really critical. And the location of the education from primary all the way to secondary to college is important.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone here and for all the valuable comments. I think now it's 2 p.m. in London time. So I think now we should move to the other session that starts now. So thank you very much. And thanks for
Thank you so much, Amir. That was really wonderful. We have a networking session. Yeah, that starts now.
Yeah, we can carry on there. Let's
okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Go ahead. Bye.
Bye.